right. So I'd received a very specific question.
Okay.
I'll read it real quick.
All right.
Just for a little context. And kind of like I already mentioned to you, you can go as far as you want in addressing this question. It's a
That's dangerous.
Well,
That's dangerous.
Do you remember that there is a timer over my right shoulder that you should keep in your peripheral vision. But you can kind of go as far as you want with this question. It's a pretty technical question. But I do think it's an opportunity to take a step back and talk a little bit about hermeneutics and how you properly interpret a narrative passage. Because a question that a lot of people have is when I read stories in the Bible and I see characters doing things, are those examples to be imitated? Right? Is this God's way of saying this was a good thing that this person did? Sometimes it seems, certainly some things are clearly bad. Some things are kind of ambiguous. I'm just not sure how I should be reading this. Right. So I think it's kind of an opportunity to help people as they read their Bibles just to understand that framework as well. But the question I received was about a little passage near the end or kind of in the middle of the book of 2 Samuel. So it's kind of during the period when David's son Absalom is seeking to usurp the throne. David has been expelled from Jerusalem. And as he's leaving, this character Shimei is cursing him as he goes. Yep. So the question was, in 2 Samuel 16, verses 5 through 13, David is being cursed by Shimei. David specifically says, "Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him." But then he instructs his son Solomon later on to not let Shimei go unpunished. So how are we to understand that? Why didn't David just forgive him? Why does he instruct Samuel to, the way that Solomon deals with it is, he kills him later on. So I think the question is what's going on there. But again, as you think, as you answer that, you can step back and also help us think about how should we be interpreting those passages in general?
Right. Well, there's a difference between prescription and description. That's the first principle, right, that we have to maintain. The "thou shalt" is different than "he did this." Yeah. That's to be perceived much differently. And that helps out. And then when you differentiate between the prescriptions, that is, that God says this is what you should do, and the descriptions, then you look at the description and you see how it aligns with the rest of biblical truth, the rest of biblical ethics, and the rest of biblical morality and righteousness. And sometimes they did things that were inappropriate. You can't go to David when he went and took Abigail to be his wife and then the other lady at the same time. He took two wives together at the same time. I can't remember what the other wife's name is.
Yeah, he had a few wives, yeah.
Yeah, but he took two at the same time in there, Abigail and this other woman. Yeah. That doesn't mean, okay, well, then just like David, I should feel free to take two wives at a time. Well, of course not. That's because it's inconsistent with
Ahinoam.
Yeah, that's Jezreel. Yeah. That's why I didn't remember.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Ahinoam. I needed a hint. Ahinoam. But anyway, we can't do that. That's descriptive. That's not prescriptive, right? So you discern that.
Even though we know David is a man after God's own heart, not everything that David did should be imitated.
That's correct. Yep. Specifically with Shimei, we understand that as the biblical characters are going through their experiences, they didn't have the luxury of the entire story that we have. They live their lives the same way we do. So God's purposes unfold chronologically in our lives. And when we're before the time where it's clear, we don't know what the end will be. Yeah. So David did not know whether or not this situation with Absalom was going to prevail or what the situation was. And Shimei was cursing him as a man who was guilty of blood, was unworthy to be king. And David had been informed, it's true. I mean, I can't build a temple. Those kind of things were true, that he was guilty. And so basically David's idea was, who knows whether he's actually speaking prophetically, that he may be speaking from God. I don't know. That basically was David's take as to why he should just leave him alone. We don't need to he said, it went in the midst of this, the Lord has returned to you the bloodshed of the house of Saul. So he was obviously a fan of Saul's.
Yeah.
And he cursed him, and Abishai wanted to kill him. And David said, no, don't do that. What have I to do with you, O son of Zeruiah? If he curses, and if the Lord has told him, curse David, then who shall say, why have you done so? So he said, I don't know whether he is speaking from the Lord or not.
Right.
I'm trusting the Lord. I'm going to remain faithful to the Lord, but my reign may be over, and I'm not certain as to how this is going to all play out. Because he's experiencing this verse by verse, even as we do, right? Yeah. As we read it. Yeah. But we have the overarching picture and can look back and say, well, why, David should have just killed the guy. He was a scoundrel.
Right.
Right. Well, David didn't know that. So that's why he treated him the way he did, out of reverence for the Lord.
Yeah. Which I think that's an important point, right? David's concern isn't Shimei. His concern is, what if this is God speaking? I don't want to dishonor the Lord by killing his prophet.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he didn't know. Yeah. So he said, we're going to wait and see. And he waited and saw. And Absalom was killed in the battle. David returns to Jerusalem. And because David said, I spared him, I'm going to let him live. Right. But then when Solomon ascended, David said to Solomon, don't allow this man, you have to execute judgment on him. Justice needs to prevail. Because now David knew that he was not a prophet.
Right.
Right. So he was just a rebel.
And he makes the claim. I mean, I think probably part of the issue is that he claims to be speaking from the Lord, right? Doesn't he? Yeah. He says, behold, he says, the Lord has avenged on you. Yeah. So he's saying the Lord is doing something that the Lord is not doing.
Right. Yeah. Right. But he had vowed not to kill him. So David said, I'm going to keep my vow. Yeah. Which shows ethics, being a man of your word. Those are principles you pull out of that, right? None of us should be talking about killing somebody, but the bigger issue, is when you pay a vow, you perform it, even to your own detriment, as the scriptures teach. But Solomon was not bound by that vow. And so he instructs Solomon that he needed to deal with him in an appropriate way. When he turned over the kingdom to Solomon, he said, justice needs to prevail. You need to execute justice on Shimei, the one who cursed me. I have declared and committed not to kill him, but you're not under that same bondage. And it would be wise for you to deal with him with a appropriate level of justice, right? So Shimei was unable to impact the reign of David. In other words, David's reign survived Shimei's hostilities, antagonisms, condemnations, and so on. But Solomon's reign was brand new, right? And one of the initial challenges of a newly ascended king is to consolidate your strength and power on the throne. And when you have known enemies that were not strong enough to impact David's reign, that did not mean that his rebellion was not strong enough to impact Solomon's reign. So he said, as a new king, as someone who doesn't have the breadth of loyalty and other things that I've enjoyed, it would be smart for you to deal with that issue and execute justice. The second thing, I think that it is in the interest of justice. He had done something, that he had raised himself up against the Lord's anointed. He had cursed David, taking the name of the Lord in vain. And that is a capital offense. Any prophet whose prophecy is not fulfilled should be killed. Right? So in the interest of that justice, he says to Solomon, secure your loyalty to God's word by doing this. Right? That's another underlying priority that David has for Solomon, his son, is to honor the word of the Lord. And one of the ways you can honor the word of the Lord is to obey the word of the Lord when it comes to people who falsely represent the Lord, right? And claim to speak for him, but do not. And so he deals with that. And then it's also, for Solomon's sake, a warning. Dealing with Shimei that way becomes a warning to anyone else who would seek to oppose Solomon's reign. His dealing with him was appropriate. Now, in Solomon's, in respect to Solomon, Solomon just didn't kill him. Solomon said, I won't kill you as long as you stay in your house.
Right.
But the day you leave your house, I will kill you. So he let the length of the man's life be up to the man. Right? So he basically put him in house arrest. So don't leave your house. The moment you leave your house, you're dead. He had a slave that ran away. He chased after him, and news was made, was reported to Solomon that he had violated the conditions of his probation, or whatever you want to call it. And so Solomon took him and said, you yourself said that this arrangement was good, that as long as you stayed in your home, you would live.
Yeah.
You yourself said that was good, but you violated it. Now you have to have the consequences. And that's when he killed him, right? So it wasn't just butchery and barbarity and vengeance. It was a gesture of mercy and grace, but justice at the same time. And so that became how David's instruction to Solomon that he kill Shimei came to be, right? And so Solomon ultimately obeyed David's instruction. So the takeaways from that, as you read those words, obviously you're not reading it like you do an epistle.
Right.
Right. So the epistolary literature has a different feel, a different impact, because every single thing said and taught in an epistle is obligatory to the believer. Making a deal not to kill somebody if they stay inside is not obligatory to the believer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You can't deal with your interpersonal issues that way.
No, and you shouldn't. But what you can say is, wow, he found a way to be merciful to somebody who deserved death.
Yeah.
He was gracious, and he found a way to be merciful to him and give the person the opportunity to determine whether or not there were going to be consequences. The issue of prudence and ethics and all those there's all kinds of principles you can pull out of that entire story. Yeah. And pull back into the New Testament and see those things demonstrated by instruction and command in the New Testament, borne out in the example of those in the Old Testament, right? In 1 Corinthians, in fact, Paul tips his hand and shows us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he is very clear when he says, referring to the Old Testament, I didn't think that looked right. I'm in 2 Corinthians. It says that in verse 6, he says, now these things happened as examples for us so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. So there's this awareness of these Old Testament accounts of events were designed to provide us illustrations of ethical, moral dilemmas, mistakes that bear consequences and so on, that we now take and benefit from and avoid those kinds of mistakes because we have them to see and observe that we would ourselves avoid. And so there is that responsibility to realize the purpose why God puts all that. And very often it seems garbage like moral behavior. I mean, just awful. You think of Judah and Tamar and that whole story, you going, whoa, that's the moral of that story is don't leave a rod and a staff with a prostitute. Right. That's not the moral of the story. But that's descriptive of
what happened.
Evil behavior. And ultimately, it's behavior that is the result of distancing oneself from one's relationship with God, with the Christ-less existence, right? That you see the results of those things. It always goes to decadence and decay, moral decay.
Yeah.
And it's what Christ came to deliver us from. So those principles you pull out, and you basically, I would say, you look at various moral or ethical principles that you can see in a story in the Old Testament, and you take those, and then you go into the New Testament and say, where are these demonstrated?
Or in the Old Testament too, right?
Yeah,
yeah, for sure.
But it's kind of case closed when you see it in the New Testament. Yeah. Those kinds of things commanded or instructed in the New Testament.
The prescriptive becomes the litmus test for the descriptive, essentially, or it becomes the
right.
Yeah, the
context.
View them, yeah,
the context in which descriptive things.
How you're supposed to take those descriptive passages.
Right.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And whenever you feel that a situation is prescriptive, but it frees your flesh to satisfy itself or indulge itself, you know that you're out of bounds.
You've read it wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
So that would be another parameter.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
okay.
very, very helpful. It's always good to be able to read the Bible a little better.
Oh, yeah. That's absolutely right. That story of Shimei is a great one.
Yep.